Hello and welcome to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. My name is Natalie Himmelrich. Welcome everyone to season 4 of the podcast. This season I've got some new things coming up, so stay tuned and make sure you sign up so that you won't miss any of the episodes coming up. Today on the podcast I'm speaking with John Henry Parker, who has experienced multiple losses in his family. From avoiding grief and its emotionality altogether after the loss of his older brother Russel, when John was just 20 years old, he could no longer do that when his son Danny died in 2009. Therapeutic writing and helping other troubled veterans, as he calls them, were his way of dealing with his loss. About this week's guest. John Henry Parker is a behavioural assessment analyst, a writer and audiobook narrator. For over 35 years, he has immersed himself in the work of personal transformation with a simple philosophy: apply everything to self first. His passion for supporting and working with transitioning veterans and their families is in memory of his son Danny, who was killed in an adrenaline-seeking, excessive speed-related motorcycle accident after completing his military service. Danny was a Purple Heart recipient, a combat veteran of 2 deployments to Afghanistan with the Army's 10th Mountain Division. John is a former peacetime Marine, and his father was a former Marine, Korean War combat veteran, and Air Force Reconnaissance photographer in Vietnam. Please enjoy today's episode. Welcome, John. It's so nice to have you, and I'm so glad to be speaking with a man and to hear your story. How are you today?
I'm really good. Thank you.
So I'm really looking forward to you sharing your story and how loss and trauma has happened in your life. How did you meet loss and trauma in your life?
My mother had Parkinson's for 35 years. And so that was just a long process. And the 2 other significant losses that I've had was my older brother from a motorcycle accident, and then my only son to a high-speed motorcycle accident.
So how old were you when your brother died?
I was about 23, 24.
Mm-hmm. And when your son died, how old were you then, or how long ago is that?
2009.
Okay.
So, yeah, it's been some years. 15 years, 14 years.
And so maybe let's start from the beginning. You mentioned your mother's illness. How did that affect, and what ages, and how did that affect you as a growing young man, or I don't know if it was teenager or young person? How did that affect you?
Well, she was very nervous all the time, and she couldn't drive. So mostly she stayed at home. And when her medications were working well enough, she would ride her bike, a large tricycle with a basket for groceries, and she was able to ride her bike once in a while. And so I would jog alongside of her or ride with her, not so much a caregiver, but in my younger years, it was just everybody looking out for her, and unfortunately, some people made fun of her, and, it was not a friendly neighborhood that I grew up in.
And how old were you at the time when you said you accompanied her on cycle trips or going for shopping?
10 to 12 years old. But she was always in a very optimistic mood. She was a very positive person. I never saw her feeling depressed or negative. She was always optimistic. So that was helpful.
And was there a time before she had Parkinson that you remember growing up with a mom without an illness, or do you actually remember just that?
Just, she was very fidgety and nervous when I was very young. So she had the onset of Parkinson's when I was very young, and it became more pronounced in my teenage years. And, in my 40s is when she passed away. But it's a very difficult illness, for people, because they're 1 minute their medication is up and they're flailing around and they're moving and there's a lot of dynamic motion. She's bumping into walls and knocking down pictures. And then, within a little while, she would go into this frozen, like catatonic state where she just had to wait for her medication to come along again. And so that was a cycle for her.
And how did that affect you as a growing up teenager?
Well, she didn't have a lot of friends. And so I don't know how it affected me other than it would just seem normal. That was just my life. I didn't really think of anything. Sometimes I wish I had a normal mom, I guess. I had friends of mine that had parents that weren't ill. And so, but we got along really well. She's a great mom.
Yeah. And you mentioned there's something about you saw other kids that had a mom without an illness. So there's obviously still a realization that the mom that you have is not able to be exactly the way that your friend's mom is. So there's maybe a very subtle way of a loss, we could say, of what would a mother look like if I had my friend's mom? I'm assuming here, but I'm guessing that as a child, we look at our friends and see what they have and realize what we don't have, or the other way around.
Right. Yeah, I think that's probably normal. My family was we didn't socialize a lot with other families. So I think that maybe had an effect on me on how I socialized as an adult, but I was pretty outgoing. But my friends, their moms would be making cookies and baking and doing all kinds of things. And my mom just wasn't that functional. So she did not cook that often, but she was, like I said, she was always loving and positive. So that was, for me, I could see that and I could feel that. So that made my childhood much more bearable, in that regard.
And how did your dad fit into this picture?
He was in the military. We were just a lower middle class family. He just went to work every day. And later in life, though, he was caring for my mother and my grandmother at the same time. So he'd get up and make breakfast for them and then go to work a couple of miles away at a plant nursery. And he would come home for lunch and make them lunch. And then he would come home, make them dinner. And then he would lay on the couch all night. And they both had little bells, and they would ring the bell for their medication and different things that they needed. So he became their full-time caregiver, until both of them passed.
Wow. And so then you mentioned also your brother in the picture, and he was older or younger? I missed that.
2 years older.
Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, he bought a new motorcycle, and he was out with his friends and in the desert outside of Phoenix. And he was intoxicated. They found cocaine and alcohol, pot, marijuana in his system. And he was riding his motorcycle near a freeway, and they think he hit a pothole in the dirt, and it shot him into the traffic. And so he was hit by an oncoming truck. And I remember my dad said, "Come to the hospital. Something's happened with Russell." And he was a mechanic, so he's always hurting himself, from time to time, needing stitches. And so I got to the hospital, and my father was waiting for me, but he wasn't waiting for us to go see Russ. He was wanting me to be there so we could identify him.
Oh. And you just mentioned before that you were only 2 years older, so that was you as a 20-year-old.
Yeah, I just got out of the military not too long after that, and so it was a shock. We were close. We had some problems, but we were close to where I guess I buried my feelings with him and just went numb, and just just didn't pay attention to it a whole lot. Just really just kind of got on with my life, and I just kind of numbed out, and didn't spend a lot of time grieving. It just took a long time for me to process it. And I don't know if I ever really processed it, but it was just my way of needing to move through grief and loss. And then when my son passed away from a high-speed motorcycle accident, that was a shock that cracked me open, and like I couldn't go numb. Like I found that I needed to move my pain because it would eat me alive. I had to do something. So I became the wounded healer. That's what I would call it. Because I found he was in the military. He was out of the military. He was in Afghanistan for 2 deployments. So he had a lot of trauma, and he had a need for adrenaline. So he would go and ride his motorcycle late at night, and it would help him come home and sleep. So, and having been in the military, my dad was in the military, in Korea and Vietnam. So I understand multi-generational trauma, and I started adopting veterans, 20, 30, 40-year-old veterans who were suffering. Because again, like my brother, my son, had a high alcohol content when he had his accident, and had marijuana in his system. And so, I started adopting, I call them at-risk veterans. They were suffering from trauma, and they were suffering from terrible, behaviors, alcohol abuse, and just unresolved trauma. So I spent 10 years kind of wandering around, finding my way through this. And eventually my pain started maturing. And I guess what I would say is that there's a level of mixed feelings that I had to process for a good while, which is, if my son's loss hadn't cracked me open so completely, I wouldn't have been open to the healing and the journey that I'd been on since his passing, and I wouldn't have become who I am. And I didn't find joy in my life until I was 53. There's absolutely no joy. There was a lot of satisfaction. There was a lot of accomplishments, but it took a lot of years of doing different types of healing, doing Native American, ceremonial work, doing plant medicines, actually, is what helped the most out of anything. I didn't really want to go to counseling. It's hard. I just wasn't comfortable going to counseling. I was in the Marine Corps, and it just wasn't something that I wanted to do. And but plant medicines, it helped me find a part of myself that was so closed down that I could tether myself to it. It was a place that I found that didn't have. Not only was it the absence of conflict and pain and trauma, but there wasn't even the possibility of that. And so I was able to find my joy that was buried really deep into my inside. And, I created a life, that I never thought I would have. So, I think that grief and loss matures. It's not something it can stay the same, and it can stay dormant. It can stay buried if we let it. But I'm just a very curious person, and I think helping others was my path to learning about myself.
So I'm interested, and I want to retract a little bit, because what we know is before you can help others, before one can become a wounded healer, there needs to be some processing or some maturing of the grief and dealing with it, of what has happened, before we can actually go and help someone else. So if you're taking us back a little bit, I'm interested, because you mentioned that the loss of your son really cracked you open. So, I mean, I heard you speak about your brother's loss and your son's loss. So there was some similarities, some obvious similarities. And also the other strand of the similarities in your life that runs through your family, as your father being in the military, you being in the military, and then your son also had some military experience. So if we're going back to the loss of your son, and if you're taking us to how did you deal with that grief and loss early on? I mean, you mentioned before when you lost your brother and you had to identify him, and that you buried your feelings and you just sort of soldiered on, I would say, in life. But then when your son died, something like that kind of reaction didn't work anymore. So what happened there, if we're tuning into that time before the wounded healer emerged? How did you deal with that?
For me, I mean, I just felt like I couldn't save my son. And I more or less started adopting veterans because I spent my career, I'm a behavioral assessment analyst. And so I study, human nature, from most of my adult life. And so I've been in the personal development field, and it was my path to recovery. So I didn't want to go to counseling early on. When I was in my early 20s, just before I got out of the military. This is answering your question in a roundabout way, but I think back to where this started for me. I was provisioned by my great aunt Gladys when I was a young boy. And she used to come live with us for 2 months a year. She was a Canadian war correspondent during World War II, during the Nazi invasion of Paris. And she wrote a book about it. And there was a documentary about her life. So I grew up with this wonderful matriarch of our family, and she would stay with us for 2 months a year. And I would be able to get up early in the morning before my sister and brother knew what was going on. They never caught on, but I would be able to sit at her feet for 2 or 3 hours every day. And she would tell me stories, and you listen to a healthy person that has strong character. When you're a young boy like I was, and she told me I was going to do something extraordinary with my life, and I believed her because she said it. And she told me early on that God is love. She studied most of the major religions of the world, and she said that she found this common thread. No matter who you talk to, the beauty of each one of their faith would be that God is love. That's kind of a foundational core belief. And so she said, if you find a religion you're happy about, then that's great. Then take it on and study it. But if you understand that God is love, you can get along with anybody from anywhere. And so I thought, again, that was really important. But she asked me, do you believe God is love? And I said, well, no, I don't, because it may be true for you, but why are these things happening to me? Like, my dad was really violent. He was an alcoholic, and it's just terrible things going on in our home. And then my neighborhood was really bad. So I'm getting beat up a lot and chased all the time. And so I'm like, why is this happening to me? So she said that I would find out that God is love in due time, and that I would find my purpose in life. And so each time, I would suffer these losses, or I'd have a traumatic event, which there were a lot. I can remember always asking myself, if God is love, why is this happening to me? Like, why is this happening to me? And then, but I found that there was a reason, or there was a purpose for my suffering. Later on in life, after Danny, my son, his loss, his passing, that I was given the gift of empathy through my pain and suffering. And so these are the kind of things that were going on in the back of my mind. like when I was going through my most devastating losses, was why is this happening to me? If God is love, like a lifelong question. So early on, you know, I had a lot to offer people that I worked with as a profession. I wouldn't say I'm a life coach. That's not really my definition, but I work in personal development and transformational development. So this is part of my journey, is that there must be some reason or purpose. Like Viktor Frankl, I studied a lot of his work. There must be some purpose of why I'm here, suffering and going through what I'm going through. And so I really kind of looked at the transformational side of my loss, and searching for meaning and purpose. And for me, it was helping others. And my son and I, we were conceptualizing an audiobook. So I started writing. That was my therapeutic process, as I wrote. And after 20 years of dealing with at-risk veterans, I was working with veterans long before he passed. So I was already in this field, trying to understand him, trying to understand myself, trying to understand him, trying to understand myself. And so I wrote a book and I recorded an audiobook that was the sum total of all I could think of for these troubled veterans and their families and why they don't seek help. My son was...
Sorry to interrupt, but when you mean the troubled veterans, what were they troubled with? When you say that, because now it makes a little bit more sense, as you were saying, you were already working with veterans before your son Danny died. So that picture now becomes a bit wider as to that was already happening. That purpose and meaning already started to unfold, and then Danny died. But what were they troubled with for people to understand that?
Well, there's different types of trauma. There's direct trauma where you experience something yourself. There's vicarious trauma where you witness somebody else in pain or suffering or getting killed. You have survivor's guilt, that you survived and somebody else didn't. You have moral injury, which is, if you knew what I've done, you wouldn't love me. And then you have compassion fatigue. So it's on a continuum. Like there's a lot of different reasons why people suffer, and then we self-medicate. And it can be workaholism. It could be drugs and alcohol. It could be sex. It could be lots of things where people are just numbing out and self-medicating to feel better, trying to make it through the day. So, and a lot of veterans, they suffer in silence, and they're called barriers to care. Like, you can't seem weak, even though we've got lots of therapeutic approaches and the military's a lot more open these days. You still have a warrior ethos where it's not okay to appear weak in any way, shape, or form. So we get trained really well, and other military around the world, we're impeccable. We look strong, we look healthy, we walk and talk, and we are impeccable. That's the facade. But I call it internal cohesion, but the outward projection that we put out in the world is often not a true reflection of who we really are inside and what we've done or what we've experienced. So that's what was really it, is that there's lots of different types of trauma. And so I would just show up and be empty and fill myself up with what's going on with the person I'm helping or talking with.
Yeah, when you say adopted a lot of veterans, how specifically did that look like? Did you have a house full of veterans, or did you have like a group, or how did you support them?
Mostly one-on-one. I do a lot of men's work. I did a lot of medicine work with men only. I understand men. I can't say that I understand women, but I definitely understand men, and there's an honesty about it. So I've done quite a bit of men's work in groups, but mostly it was when I say adopting them, my Aunt Glad, she taught me the law of reciprocity, which is what I really, really, really got a lot out of, which is number one, show up, because most people don't show up in the world consistently. And number two is do what you say you're going to do, which a lot of people don't do. And number three, care about the outcomes of the person that you're trying to help genuinely. And number four, ask nothing in return. And that's what I did for 20 years, 25 years is call people and check in on them, and earn their trust, because it's not easy for veterans to trust people, and so that's what I mean. It's just, I would adopt them. I would take it seriously. And, I haven't lost any of the veterans that I worked with in 25 years, and we're still really close, and they're all doing really well. They're better fathers. They're better husbands. And, I'm really, really proud of the work that I did, but they would be questioning, like, what do you want from me? Why are you being nice to me? So after Danny passed, part of the therapeutic writing process became recording this audiobook. And it might make sense when I explain this. I wrote it as a dual narration, which means I have another person playing the role of the critical mind, where I play the role of the rational, reasonable mind. And the irrational, critical mind, this other veteran, he was a really tough guy from New York, and he was a veteran as well. And so he plays this irrational mind that's constantly hijacking moments. It doesn't have to be just veterans. Anybody who's had trauma or depression or anxiety, they know what I'm talking about. Like this back of your mind, you're like, I'm not good enough. What's wrong with this picture? I'm in danger. There are lots of different ways that your critical mind can hijack moments when you're with your family or with your friends or whatever, and you're not really here. So that's what the whole thing was about. It was this duality of how to self-regulate when you're triggered. How do you recognize that you're recognizing, so you can see that you're triggered? And like when I'm out with my wife, I don't do it anymore, but I would tell her I'm triggered, and she would know that I'm okay. There's nothing she needs to do. I'm taking care of myself, and then I kind of collect myself, and then I'd be okay, but just recognizing that I was triggered was the first step. The second thing was to notice that I'm not breathing, like I'm ruminating on something. And so I learned how to breathe, the square breathing process, where you breathe in through your nose for 5, you hold for 5, you breathe out for 5, you hold for 5, and you repeat that 3 or 4 times, and you can feel your heart rate slow down, and then the third step is to focus on something more interesting, like someone you love, or a puppy, or your child. There's so many things you can change your focus to. And that is a process that I share in this audiobook that I developed for myself to self-regulate it. I showed it to my son, and then we decided to do this audiobook. And so I finished writing it after he had passed. And so I would just say therapeutic writing for anybody, even if you never show anybody, even if you write it in a journal and burn the journal, you get it outside of yourself. Once I saw it, it was no longer part of me. It was outside of myself, and I can see it, then I can edit it, and then I can get it just the way I want it. And in that perfection of what I thought was satisfying, it was no longer inside of me. So that for me was the way forward. And then it turned into this book that's publishing this month, the second book. So this is, for me, writing has been very, it's terrifying to think that people are going to read this actually at some level. And on another level, I'm just glad it's outside of me. I don't have to hold this interior anymore, together.
So there's something really beautiful that shows up for me right now as I listen to you, of where you're talking about your family history, and you shared with us about the violence in your family growing up, and your mother and Aunt Gladys coming to stay, and then also the things that were the repeating trauma, but also the repeating history in your family. And it seems now, talking to you, there's this beautiful transformation of generational trauma or generational habits that were already formed before you, that in some way you have transformed and transitioned.
Yeah, well, I can tell you the most important agreement that I ever made to Glad, it's in the book, is she made me promise. Not made me, she's, you're going to be an adult and you're going to have a family someday and you're going to have children, most likely. And they're going to be, needing something from you that's different than what your father's giving you. Like, you understand violence, you understand how abusive your father is. And so she and I made a promise that when I was older, and if I had children, that I would never hit them in anger. I would never be violent with them. And I promised her that, because when you are violent towards your children, or they're violent towards you, that fractures something that's never the same again. And so we made that promise. And then when my son was 8 years old, I sat him down about the time I was making the promise with Glad, and we made the promise that we would never hit each other. Discipline is different. Hey, you have to get their attention, but I'm talking about just rage and violence, that hitting him, or him hitting me. When he was 22, 24, he thanked me for that. He forgot it a few times when he was a teenager, and we had very, very scary confrontations where we were at risk of, fighting each other. But I would just remind him of the promise. Like, you may have forgotten it, but I didn't, and I'm not going to hit you, right? I'm not fighting you, and he ultimately thanked me for that. So these are the little things we broke that chain through the men in our heritage, our family history, and that to me was the biggest accomplishment, because he never hit his children. He disciplined them, but he didn't show them that violent side.
So how did you as a couple, you and your wife, deal with the loss of you said your only son?
She's just extremely supportive. She lets me go through what I'm going through, and there's ups and downs. I was depressed. I've never been an alcoholic, but I have had a substance abuse problem at times where I would just want to numb out, so I had to go through that phase. I smoked a lot of marijuana when I was younger, and then I think that's what I meant when I said about my brother Russ, I just numbed out. Well, I smoked a lot of pot, and I just checked out, and now I can't smoke pot at all. I used to smoke it because I hated myself, or I didn't want to feel anything. And now I like myself. I don't need to change my state of mind. I don't like that. It doesn't feel good. And I don't like the paranoia that comes along with it. But I can see now that numbing out, especially with vets, they don't really open up until they get enough truth serum in them, alcohol, and then it can come out in lots of different ways. So I kind of hid out with them for a while. Actually, I think that's the truth, is I was hiding out with them, getting crazy, and just kind of being there and hearing their stories. I got sick for a while, though, because I was hearing too much trauma. I was just taking it in, all their stories. And I went to get some live blood analysis, which is a pretty fascinating thing, where they take your blood and they put it under a microscope immediately after they draw it. And you can see your individual cells, like hundreds and thousands of them. And you see this little dynamic life force in each individual cell. And it's a godlike experience to see that. And I remember this technician, the person that was sitting down with me, said, "What do you do for a living?" Because typically they're supposed to be round, they're supposed to be bouncing off of each other, and some viscosity. They're supposed to, like lubrication in your natural system, but mine were all oxidated and clumped together and almost brown. And he was like, "What do you do for a living?" I'm like, "Well, I work with veterans, and I work with traumatized veterans." He's like, "You should get a different job, or learn how to deal with it."
Balance in life. I mean, it's interesting how trauma or dealing with trauma has changed over the years. And not so long ago, I remember as I was studying trauma in somatic experience, the veterans were treated by watching movies, sort of what we now know is re-traumatizing, and sort of to desensitize them from their trauma. Later they found, okay, well, that's not actually helpful, that's just re-traumatizing. And they've come a long way to use the somatic approach, to the point now, even in 2011, when we had the trauma rescue teams come into New York to help the victims, or help the survivors, not the victims, the survivors from the 9/11. And then even they had groups and they were talking about their trauma, sort of re-traumatizing, where they now know there's a sweet spot between the amount of retelling your story that is needed to not re-traumatize someone. And it's not by telling your story again and again. And as you were just sharing with your blood analysis, it has an effect on people. And you mentioned that before, where primary trauma is when you're in it, secondary trauma when you watch someone, and then third level is when you hear it spoken about. Even that, as in your example, has a big impact.
Well, there's some aspects of sharing your story and moving that energy. But there's also not just the somatic side, but the epigenetic side of being able to understand that your thoughts create the emotions you experience, and the emotions create the chemical soup that's developed and produced inside of your body. That's really great. Joe Dispenza's work, Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself, Bruce Lipton's work, The Biology of Belief, really, really understanding epigenetics, that you're not just predisposed to your genetic, heritage, that your thoughts are things. So I find myself talking to vets a lot about, what anger and rage creates? Cortisol, right? So everybody's heard that fundamentally, basically, and that cortisol not good for you. Like massive amounts of ongoing cortisol all the time must have something to do with your attitudes and your emotions, and your thoughts are creating your attitudes and emotions. And so taking control of your thoughts is a big part of my work, which, I study behavior, and we have conditioned ways of being. It's called predictive behavioral analysis. If you have a particular way of dealing with things and there's a particular stress level, if you change your thoughts, you change the emotions. Like in the audiobook that I recorded, the first one, this hardcore veteran, just really, really traumatized, kind of remote, isolated. But the instant I said, "Do you remember when your daughter was born? Were you there?" He's like, "Oh yeah." And I said, "What was it like when she looked into your eyes and you noticed she was looking at you and you were looking at her? What was that connection like?" And he's like, "Oh yeah, that was a moment." And he instantly went from skeptical, difficult, to like soft and pliable. And I'm like, "Do you notice what just happened? Like, I didn't do anything. You did it. You just thought. You changed your thoughts, and you had a really, really nice, warm emotion that opened up, and your facial expressions relaxed, your body language relaxed." And he got it. He's like, "Wow, so your thoughts are things." So this is the kind of work that when I work with people with trauma, like you're not triggered all the time. There's parts of you that are still traumatized, but you can live a fairly normal life. And if you treat it like a part, not the whole, doesn't represent who you are as a whole, it represents that there's part of you that's really hurting, it becomes more manageable. And then ultimately you can collapse the boundaries of the part into the whole. That's what I mean, like trauma matures. And if you do your work and you you focus on the meaning and purpose that this is bringing you, it helps transcend a lot of the most difficult parts of trauma. And in my experience, that's how it works for me. I can't speak for other people, but I have noticed the softening effect with some pretty hard people. Like I've seen really hardcore veterans years later after they've had kids, and they're whole different people. You can find a moment, but that's what I point is that everybody has a moment, whether it was a puppy, a kitten, a relative. There was moments that they had where they were safe. They were feeling love. They were feeling things that were really, really beneficial to them. So taking people back to those moments is a big part of realizing that there's a bigger part of you that has the capacity to heal.
So from your years of experience, before we then go into the rapid fire question, what would you want other veterans to know that would greatly improve their journey with PTSD, with survivor's guilt and all the traumas that you've mentioned? What would you want them to know if they were listening? Or if someone is listening who knows someone that is a veteran?
I would say for me, it's a very private journey for most veterans. You know, we learn how to be in our cave, and it's wet and it's cold and it's dark, and we're okay. We can handle it. It's a cave of our own making, but it doesn't have to be that way. It's not a life sentence. And for me, personal development, I was told by somebody really important in my mid-20s, early 20s, to go to the bookstore and go to the self-help section, not the psychology section, and start picking up books about and start reading about who you're becoming. And so for me, it's about focusing on who you're becoming. Yes, bad things have happened. No kidding. They happen and they're real. And sooner or later, when you do enough personal and transformational, maybe even spiritual development, I came to a realization that I deserve to live a fulfilling life. And then after I had that for a long enough time, I came to the second conclusion, which is I deserve to be happy. But it didn't come easy, but it came through transformational development.
Yeah,
listening to audiobooks for me.
I can subscribe to that, definitely. So we're going to put all those links that you've mentioned and the inspirations that you have in the show notes, so people can go and find them there without having to memorize them. Shall we do the rapid fire questions now?
Sure. Yes.
So grieving and trauma means?
Growth.
And healing means?
Joy.
And what I have learned about myself in the light of loss and trauma?
I say this in my book, that grief and loss are my greatest teachers, and trauma is a close third.
And one thing that you wish people knew about loss and trauma?
It's the seasons of life. You're here for a purpose. You know, other people might not be here for very long, but for me, find what brings meaning and purpose. Find something. There must be some reason that you're here in this world, and it's up to us to find it.
And the last one specific thing that has changed since your loss and trauma that you wouldn't want to miss.
I used to feel guilty because I've grown so much from the loss, and I wouldn't have grown had I not been cracked open. You know, there's a singer from decades ago named Otis Taylor. He wrote a song called "Live Your Life," and he said, "Death isn't going to touch you in your heart. It's just going to come on up. It's just going to walk on up and knock you down. That's as real as it gets." But finding meaning and purpose, like, why is this happening to me? Like, what am I supposed to be doing with my life? And move your pain. Initially, it may just be a process of moving your pain, finding something to do, and then kind of grows from there.
Well, thank you so much, John, for your openness and your willingness to just take us through that whole journey that was full. And I'm so grateful that you have these resources for veterans out there who definitely have had a lot of share of our collective trauma. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. If you'd like to be updated on future episodes, please subscribe to my newsletter on nataliehimmelrich.com. If you need grief support, please contact me for a 30 minutes free discovery session. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. To support this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. And remember to keep breathing. I promise it will get easier.